National Alliance for Radiation Readiness, Radiation Training Modules for Public Health. The following module was developed by the National Alliance for Radiation Readiness with funding provided by the Radiation Injury Treatment Network and support from the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials and Applied Research Associates. Phase 3, Hours 96 and Beyond. Welcome to Module 4 and the final module of our training series. This module highlights the considerations that take place during hours 96 and beyond. By this time, you and your team have established a rhythm. Keeping a clear head with a bigger picture perspective is essential. Similar to other devastating incidents, the infrastructure of a community may be severely impacted depending on its proximity to ground zero. Evacuees will be seeking admittance back into their neighborhood to assess damage or to simply return home. Temporary shelters and assistance centers will need to evaluate and consider long-term solutions. Responder fatigue will be setting in and a sense of self and family safety may begin to surface. These internal drivers are normal after a traumatic experience and should be expected. Listen to what Andrew Rozak, Senior Director of Emergency Preparedness with Child Care Aware of America, had to say about Phase 3, 96 hours and beyond.
So Phase 3 is when we're really going to start setting up the framework for what long-term recovery looks like. And of course, that's going to be dictated by how big the incident was, how big the impact is. But starting to think about, how are we going to get people into long-term housing, start getting them on the road to recovery, getting folks back to work, getting communities rebuilt. And that's going to be very challenging for a number of different reasons. There, as we've seen in other disasters, there may be a stigma attached with folks that were victims. And, especially when it comes to radiation, people don't really understand what that is. So messaging, again, is going to be very important as we think about the long-term issues. What we don't want to happen is have communities that are afraid to take folks that are evacuating because they're afraid of radiation. We've seen some of that in Ebola, and gosh, you think back to the 70s and 80s about AIDS and all sorts of stuff. So we need to learn those lessons, and we need to figure out how to get ahead of that curve so that people aren't afraid that while these people are evacuating for radiation, they're coming to my community and we're going to get sick or we're going to get contaminated. So really heavy lift on the messaging still. I think other longer term issues, involve the feeding and the sheltering of folks. Housing is always the #1 impediment for getting folks back to work and starting recovery. But then after housing, childcare is usually the second biggest impediment. So figuring out where to live and figuring out where kids can go so parents can get back to work is really going to be key in that 96 hours and beyond.
Role. By hour 96, you have either been actively engaged or maybe just coming into the response to relieve peers. Follow your emergency operations plan and report appropriately. Upon arrival, obtain as much information as needed to fulfill your assigned responsibility. Assessments of both human and environmental impacts will be prioritized. Utilize situational awareness, supported by laboratory analysis, environmental impact assessments, and expert input to assist with directing the various areas of response. Basics. The role of a public health responder should intertwine with other response agency roles seamlessly and be identified in the emergency operations plan, but there are a few overarching considerations that every responder should be aware of. Depth of bench. Exhaustion will be setting in for those first-line responders. Radiation incidents are not acute and workforce continuity is critical. Those transitioning out should fully brief their replacement, then sign out to rest until the next rotation. Responders must maintain acuity, which also means awareness of one's own needs to maintain health. Here is Regional Emergency Manager for Eastern Nebraska, Bill Pook's thoughts on responder exhaustion.
Well, it's going to be just exhaustion. It's going to be exhaustion of responders, it's going to be exhaustion of the command and control staff, and it's going to be exhaustion of our citizens. And when people get restless, things just happen. You start to go off script. You're going to be presented with challenges that are not necessarily things that you can practice for. A lot of anxiety, a lot of personal demands, a lot of personal tragedies going on, separation anxieties. So those long-term recovery operations, probably by that time, are going to be more challenging than people recognize, just because of the longevity of it.
Evacuation. At this stage, evacuation can be looked at from two perspectives. There will be those that were sheltering in place for 72 hours and may face challenges in evacuating. Damage to building structures and the environment can pose as obstacles, as well as those that are fearful to emerge from sheltering. Then there will be those that evacuated immediately and by hour 96 are determined to return to their homes. Perimeters will need to be established by zones for readmittance, remediation, or non-entry. These perimeters will require security with clear, understandable messaging for those leaving and those re-entering. Reunification. The day and time of the incident will impact the number of displaced persons. If the incident occurs on a weekday, children may be at school while parents are at places of employment. Families may find it challenging to reunite as a variety and number of community reception centers and shelters have been established to screen and take in evacuees. A system for reunification should be developed and exercised, if possible, prior to an incident of any size. Long-term impact analysis. The true human impact will become clearer as epidemiological analysis is completed. Results from environmental assessments and testing will also become available and determine the extent of damage to food, water, and ground resources. Recovery. This phase will include the transition from response to recovery, as communities will need to adapt to a new normal. Listen to some points that Chris Williams, Washington State Department of Health, made.
Interestingly, when we do our exercises for radiation events, it's usually the first day, first couple of days. We don't oftentimes get to the long-term impacts. And we are planning in our state to do some long-term radiation exercises. But it is talking about how do we deal with the population who, say, has been evacuated. What do we do about the agricultural lands in the area, and how do we coordinate with our partner agencies on those intersecting areas where our public health work and our other sectors are engaged together. So we have to be thinking really about the long-term recovery aspects of those interests.
Communications. Response during this phase will include an abundance of public messaging. Identification of a public information officer that is respected and trusted by the community, and a Joint Information Center, or JIC, opened or be in the process of standing up. Ideally, a representative from all responding entities should be present in the JIC to draft concise and consistent messaging for the public. The public will be relying on the PIO to provide information regarding their safety along with their families. People will need to have clear directions on where to go and how to get there. Education will need to be given on what decontamination is and how to best decontaminate themselves. Defining what safe is will be a public priority. This will include long-term decontamination messaging for returning to residences, land use, and availability of utilities. Any large-scale incident will instill fear, and a radiation incident will likely be worse. There is an unwarranted fear when it comes to radiation. Complexity or simply a lack of knowledge will need to be recognized when an incident occurs. Planning by adopting pre-scripted messages into your plan, identifying a trusted voice, and developing a systematic approach to handling rumors will foster an adaptive and organized situation. Bill Pook, Eastern Nebraska Regional Emergency Manager, put it this way.
Well, I've been in the business as a civilian for 20 years now, and I've actually seen a great change and improvement in how all these other sub-agencies approach the concept of a nuclear or radiological incident. So that's very encouraging for me. The introduction of NIMS and the Incident Command System and all hazards approach seems to have taken care of a lot of otherwise separate planning challenges. So the idea that somebody from a rural fire district can come in and participate, or somebody from a federal agency can participate shoulder to shoulder, I think we're better prepared to merge these types of agencies. And when it comes to nuclear rad, there's just better education out there. I've just witnessed it.
Community reception centers and shelters. Local public health jurisdictions will have or will be in the process of standing up community reception centers, or CRCs, and shelters to support decontamination and the evacuation of impacted individuals. The needs of these displaced will be great, from basic day-to-day hygiene supplies to radiological decontamination and screening. Injuries could range from no injuries to needing immediate critical care. CRCs are not expected to handle injuries beyond simple first aid, but should have a plan to handle more severe needs. Pre-identified shelters that open for intake should coordinate with CRCs, and vice versa, on how individuals are able to commute from one facility to the next, as well as identify compatible tracking systems. A singular tracking system has not been adopted nationally. This recommendation may be challenging for jurisdictions that prefer or own different systems. Another challenge may arise from the sheer number or high throughput of individuals processing through a CRC and then directed to a shelter. Planning across disciplines, pre-incident to identify systems and processes will best support a streamlined response. Environmental decontamination. Now that we've touched on human decontamination in relation to community reception centers, there is also a need to focus resources on environmental monitoring and decontamination. Radiation levels will determine safety zones for re-entry or for the continued need for evacuation. Building structures, land, and waterways will all need to be assessed for contamination before re-entry. Utilities, agriculture and livestock, as well as other industries will be impacted in such an incident. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, have crafted message templates that can be customized for any jurisdiction and affected service. Healthcare. Shelter-in-place orders will begin to be lifted, and there may be an influx of persons reporting to healthcare facilities. Healthcare systems may need to move non-critical patients to surrounding hospitals to allow for surge capacity. Healthcare systems can expect an influx of individuals with both physical and psychological injury. Public messaging and coordination with CRCs can lessen the burden on healthcare systems. Communication channels must be available and open to support this type of interagency coordination between healthcare, public health, and emergency management. Listen to Donna Early.
If you just look at mass casualties anywhere, Katrina, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, after that first 24 hours, when your response capabilities start to return, then those patients will get transported somewhere, either by plane, by helicopter, by car, or whatever. So yes, you would expect that delayed treatment of people who still need significant medical care. A small community hospital may not get that many, but certainly the larger centers will. The communities have coalitions of public health, the nursing homes, for instance, rehab, different levels of care, but as well as law enforcement. So most hospitals actively drill with police and fire and local response agencies to make sure, again, that everybody understands their roles and that everybody's comfortable in their personal protection. So it's really important that you trust your partners. So if the first responders say we've decontaminated someone, that you have some level of trust that they've actually done that.
If the radiation incident results in exposure, there are additional considerations for the distribution and administration of cytokines. Hospitals may have these medical countermeasures, or MCMs, to treat exposed persons. However, medication will be in limited supply. Public health will look to the Strategic National Stockpile, or SNS, for pharmaceuticals, antivirals, antiemetics, personal protective equipment, or PPE, as well as other supplies. Additional guidance for the administration of cytokines is available through the Radiation Injury Treatment Network and the National Alliance for Radiation Readiness. Whether there is concern for contamination, exposure, or both, screening and then long-term monitoring are essential for continued recovery. The strength of our healthcare system will be tested as practitioners will be needed to follow up with patient care and assist with long-term monitoring. Laboratories. Similar to healthcare systems, laboratories should anticipate an influx of samples. The size and type of incident will factor into the number of samples and appropriate testing to prepare for. Biodosimetry is the laboratory method used to measure radiation exposure, and bioassay is the laboratory method used to measure internal contamination of radiation. Each method, if applicable to the incident, will be overwhelmed with sample influx during an incident. Regardless, packaging and labeling protocols to support surge capacity should be widely disseminated and written into plans of an incident and regularly confirmed. Laboratories can follow prioritization guidance for radiation samples like the one published by the National Alliance for Radiation Readiness in 2012, titled Prioritization of Laboratory Samples Following a Radiological Event Considerations. This or similar guidance will be essential for sustainability and to provide situational reports to decision makers. Partners. Time should be spent during planning to focus on consequence management. Consequence management includes the measures to protect public health and safety, restore essential government services, and provide emergency relief to governments, businesses, and individuals affected by the consequences of a chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or explosive incident. Approaching this phase with this concept will assist in identifying partners for long-term recovery. The economic impact for long-term recovery will affect both public health and medical systems. The sooner areas are established safe and able to resume daily operations, the lesser the sustained impact will be on these systems. Wrap up. Long-term support services. To wrap up Phase 4, we need to acknowledge the specific areas related to long-term recovery that are not seen as prominently throughout the other phases. This includes a need for organized volunteers, donation management, and mental health services. After catastrophic incidents, it is common to see an inpouring of donations and support. Physical donations will require staffing and physical space, which may be unrealistic for many impacted communities. Surrounding jurisdictions may become staging areas. Secure websites have been established during other incidents to collect monetary donations. However, a system must be in place with a process determined on how to disseminate these funds and/or apply them to recovery efforts. These good intentions can easily become a burden on weakened communities with damaged infrastructures. This was the case during recovery efforts from a recent hurricane, where hundreds of pallets of drinking water was wasted on an unusable airstrip. In preparedness, we rely on debriefings and after-action reports, or AARs, to identify strengths and areas of improvements that will prepare us for future incidents. The October 1, 2017 incident in Las Vegas, Nevada, provided lessons for the preparedness planning community. Among these lessons included the establishment of support services. A temporary family assistance center was set up quickly to support victims and the families of victims. It was quickly recognized that a long-term solution was critical, and just 22 days later, the Vegas Strong Resiliency Center opened, offering case management for family services, counseling, victim advocacy, legal aid, and other support. Staffed by state and local agencies, the Resiliency Center offered a place of support for individuals and the community to heal. In conjunction with the Resiliency Center, the Nevada Department of Public and Behavioral Health established a responder recovery work group to support the specific needs of responders. Although different types of incidents, the types of essential services for recovery are parallel. Listen to some final thoughts from our series subject matter experts. Cullen Case, Program Manager, Radiation Injury Treatment Network.
I think my experience or what I've seen communicating with emergency management and public health around the nation is those that are involved with radiation preparedness understand the complexity and the challenges, but are not overwhelmed by that. They continue to chip away at it to make the nation better prepared. A lot of the additional peers within the emergency management public health community that don't focus on radiation disasters specifically often discount the scenario because they assume it's going to be way too much, that we're just going to be completely overwhelmed. And I believe that the reason for that is they immediately harken back to Cold War era images of megaton bombs being detonated, and that it's not going to matter, we're in a metropolitan area that's going to be completely wiped out, versus taking into consideration the current planning scenarios that expect a 1 KT or 10 KT or device that is going to be devastating, but if we work together and just keep chipping away, we can make a difference.
Andrew Rozak, Senior Director of Emergency Preparedness with Child Care Aware of America.
You know, radiation is it's a big topic, and certainly people spend careers studying radiation and these type of events. So what I would like to see is, recognition that this is a big topic. However, you're not in this alone. There's many, many resources that are out there to help you, many experts that can be called upon, many resources that can come to bear. Oftentimes, it's just a matter of knowing who to connect with, what phone calls to make, what resources to ask for, that can really be a big help. We certainly know that there's a lot of different competing priorities, and I don't think it's expected that anyone becomes a radiation expert. However, you do need to know who those touch points are, when to pull those levers and ask for help and get the cavalry coming. That would be a real key success, I think, of the video series, is having that awareness. Who to call, what to ask for, and when to call would be a huge help. Because, quite frankly, we don't get this kind of training, we don't talk about it, and during a disaster is not the time to be figuring these issues out.
Donna Early, Executive Director for Environmental Health and Safety, Cedars-Sinai Medical Center.
I think a much better understanding about what's expected of all the partners and how we can all work together. I think that that in the past people have trained in silos, and that in order for us to be successful, to really make a difference in the lives of the public, we all have to work together.
Christopher Williams, Deputy Director, Washington State Department of Health in the Office of Radiation Protection.
The most important thing is to develop those relationships early, when the temperature isn't that hot, when you do have time to get to know people. You exchange your business cards then, not during the actual incident. That's key. And through a series of engagements, you develop good working relationships so that when the emergency occurs, you actually know people and not just a name on the other end of a phone or an email. The most important thing during any situation, whether it's radiation or otherwise, is a good situational awareness and sharing of information. Keeping that line of communication open is going to be critical in those first response hours. Prior to the emergency is to work with your communication staff who can help craft messages in advance, particularly, like I said, for radiation, where some of the isotopes you'll be working with a power station or other situations like that. Just to have them engaged early on too, so that you've got good messages ready to go and a good plan to move forward with that.
Bill Pook, Regional Emergency Manager, Eastern Nebraska.
One thing that I might say is that the world of radiological preparedness and the world of all hazards programs, which is severe weather, chemical related, or mass casualty, really cannot be separate. They really have to be brought together under a common operating picture for either one to succeed, for one to benefit off the other. And for a long time, radiological planning has been left to a few communities with a specific identifiable threat. And they kept it separate. We have to bring them all in together. So people that have multi-hazard plans should have an annex, at least, for radiological emergency response, should incorporate it into it.
After completing this series, it should be no surprise to hear that a large-scale radiation incident will be complex and challenge even the most resilient communities. We hope the considerations offered during these modules have provided valuable guidance from subject matter experts and peers in planning, response, recovery, and mitigation. One final closing thought from Cullen Case.
As an emergency manager, plans are everything that we do. We create them, we update them, we read them, we review them, but it seems, in my experience, that we might be the minority that are actually doing that. So the real benefit is in the process of planning. So as Winston Churchill, I think that plans are nothing, planning is everything, or something to that effect. But the value is in going through the process and talking to everyone that's going to be involved within your sphere of influence, so that in that process, they get educated a little bit about how they might be involved. You get educated a little bit. You make those connections so that when you call them to ask for something, they answer the phone, ideally a little bit faster than they might if somebody else calls them, just because they realize that when you're calling that it's probably something urgent and quite important. So it's that process is the key. And then exercises, follow through with that as well. That after you've got that, doing an exercise, and it kind of falls into the same thing. Is that those that are involved likely haven't read the plan, or maybe took a cursory look at it right before the exercise. So it's that opportunity to really reinforce kind of what their role is going to be and what's going to be expected of them, so that they know how to tie into you and your activities.
Please visit www.radiationready.org for additional resources, or email NARR@asto.org with specific inquiries.